Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to have a little bit of a soft opening as our numbers begin to populate. I'm delighted to tell you we have about 150 people participating for this wonderful gathering with Kirsten Delegard and the Mapping Prejudice Project. So we'll give it a couple minutes. I might say today is the 55th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act, August 6th, 1965.
Wow.
Red letter, epical date in the history of the United States for any number of reasons. And of course, it relates significantly to what we're going to learn from our distinguished presenter, Kirsten Delegard. So let's look at our numbers. We're up to 64. That's terrific. I've seen this presentation a few times, and each time I learn something different, and it's wonderful. And it's one of the great educational opportunities we have, both about Minneapolis, but of course it has national implications too. So in a couple minutes we will get, or a couple seconds really, we'll get started as I see our numbers are coming in, but perhaps at a slower rate, which means that we perhaps have a significant cohort of the number of people who are going to participate. And with that, we'll get started. Welcome to the JCRC Living Room webinar series today with Dr. Kirsten Delegard. Welcome, Kirsten. A little bit of an introduction here. Folks who have participated in the past, we've had some wonderful presentations with Neil Kashkari, along with our partner, the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, Ambassador Dennis Ross, Lori Sturdivant, journalist and author, Sarah Tuttle Singer, an Israeli journalist and author, and others. Of course, want to thank our JCRC staff, Laura Zell, Ellen Morrissey, Sami Rahami, Ethan Robertson, the entire team, and then two of Kirsten's colleagues, Maggie Mills and Russell Starlack, important part of the team of Kirsten's research. Confluence of dates and anniversaries that we should keep in mind. June 15th was the 100th anniversary of the Duluth lynchings of Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, Isaac McGee. JCRC is a participant in many of the commemorative activities deferred because of COVID-19 until next year. Keynote speaker, hopefully, will be Brian Stevenson. He committed this year. We're hopeful that Brian will speak next year in Duluth. A couple days, 5 days or so, will be the 75th anniversary of VJ Day. For 1 million African American soldiers that was fighting for democracy, home and abroad. Desegregated the war industries, FDR 1941, desegregation of the military by President Truman in 1947. As I noted before, just today is the 55th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act, a piece of legislation like the Civil Rights Act in 1964 that transformed American polity and made it possible to elect significant numbers of African Americans to legislatures, to the Congress, to the United States Senate, and ultimately President Barack Obama. Yesterday, Stephen Belton, my dear friend and the president and the Urban League Twin Cities, and I made a little PSA in front of the statue to Hubert Humphrey, encouraging people to vote on the primary Tuesday and, of course, in the general election in November. As I said in that video, it's our chance to shape our destiny, and voting is ever so important. Of course, we've also had the murder of George Floyd and the resulting consequences of that heinous act, and that certainly relates to what we're going to learn from Kirsten today. All of these events punctuate Kirsten's groundbreaking research into Minneapolis, quote, barriers, including restrictive housing covenants, which stop many people from buying property and building wealth most of the last century. Kirsten, Dr. Delegard, received her PhD in history from Duke, where she trained as a women's historian. She's also started the History-apolis Project. Kirsten holds faculty affiliations with a number of programs at the University of Minnesota and has been a legacy research fellow at the Minnesota Historical Society. The National Endowment of the Humanities has awarded her a fellowship. Someday, and I hope that day is soon, she'll write a new history of Minneapolis, city of light and darkness, the making of a progressive metropolis in Minneapolis. And we hope that day comes too, Kirsten, amongst your many, many other projects. We're greatly pleased to welcome you. You've spoken before the JCRC board, the Cardozo Society, other Jewish organizations, and many places around town, locally, regionally, and nationally. So it's a great honor to have you here, Kirsten, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. I'm so thrilled to be here today. So we actually took a little bit of a hiatus from doing a lot of presentations with the onset of the pandemic and then the murder of George Floyd. So it's my great honor to be back doing these community conversations again, and I'm glad that the JCRC is one of the first groups that we're restarting this conversation. So, so as Steve has already said, since we started Mapping Prejudice, I've given dozens of talks about mapping prejudice, about the data, about our research, where I describe the history of housing discrimination in Minneapolis. And in each of these presentations, I would say I issued something of a warning. I would say we have the highest racial disparities in the country. So this is killing Black people. It's unjust, but it's also unsustainable. That ultimately this is going to rip our community apart. And then, of course, as we all know, on the evening of May 25th, George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police. From this corner at 38th and Chicago, demonstrations and civil unrest spread around the city and the world. So what began here in Minneapolis has mushroomed into the largest protest in American history. So the researchers have done a quick count, and 1 month after Floyd's death, approximately 20 million Americans had joined public demonstrations for Black Lives Matter. So in the wake of all these events, Mapping Prejudice has been fielding inquiries from people from all around the world who want to know why this started in Minneapolis. So our team has been able to provide one slice of this larger explanation, this history of racial covenants, and the willful amnesia around this history of discriminatory housing practices in Minneapolis. So that's, of course, what I'm going to talk about today. But first, before I really dive into the history, I always think it's important for me to situate myself in this story. So I'm a third-generation Minneapolitan. That means that my grandparents started settling in Minneapolis in the 1920s, and my family has never left. Like a lot of young Minnesotans, I did leave for a couple of decades. I got trained as a professional historian, but then, like a lot of people born in Minnesota, I came home. And it was when I came home that I decided that I wanted to study the history of my hometown. Immediately, I was forced to confront what I would say some of the central teachings were when I was growing up in Minneapolis. When I was growing up, I was taught by my family, by my teachers, by community leaders that Minneapolis was largely immune from many of the challenges that were plaguing a lot of other cities at the time. I would say that this narrative has definitely come under challenge, especially in recent years, but until Memorial Day, I believe that most white Minnesotans remained invested in the idea that their largest city, in the words of the New York Times, quote, seemed to have all the answers. They nodded in agreement when this commentary was published in The Atlantic that went so far as to call Minneapolis a miracle. So like many of my neighbors and my family members, I appreciate the things that have brought my hometown all these accolades. The parks, the arts, the communitarian impulses of my neighbors who love to volunteer. I'm grateful for this strong economy that has allowed so many generations of my family to thrive here. But ultimately, my message is that this talk of miracles has been ultimately destructive because it eclipsed what the coronavirus pandemic and the murder of George Floyd has made impossible to ignore. That Minnesota, in the words of many of my Black neighbors, is a great place to live if you're white. It's not so nice to be a person of color here. So our racial disparities are some of the highest in the country by many measures. What does that mean? It means that Black people are way more likely than white residents to suffer poverty, to experience violence, to struggle with chronic illnesses. They're way less likely to graduate from high school. And housing is at the root of all of these other disparities. Without safe and affordable housing, It's almost impossible to access healthcare or education. You can't shelter in place during a pandemic. You're more vulnerable to crime. So to believe in this miracle of Minneapolis, you have to ignore this inequality. You have to ignore racism, and you have to silence the past. You have to forget deliberately how we got to the place that we are today. So Black people have never had the luxury of forgetting. And what we're doing with Mapping Prejudice is our team is calling on everyone to remember fully the history. These contemporary racial disparities that we have are not the result of some natural order. Our map illuminates how developers used racial covenants to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people at a really critical moment in the development of the metropolitan area. So in Minneapolis, in Hennepin County, and we believe it'll be around the same date in Ramsey County, this practice started in 1910 with this deed that I put on the slide here. It shows that Henry and Leonora Scott sold a property on 35th Avenue South to a man named Nels Anderson. He was a Swedish baker. He built an extremely modest house that had a chicken coop out back, but the deed for this modest house had included this racial restriction that I've highlighted here. It stipulated that, quote, the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. The person who wrote this, his name was Edmund Walton. He ran one of the largest real estate development companies in the Twin Cities at the time. And that company went on to put this same language into thousands of property deeds across the Twin Cities. I'm going to read you some of these deeds. I do this in every presentation, and I do it even though this material can be very disturbing, but we think it's really important to call out racism and name whiteness. So this first one, no person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. And that's from 1946, by the way. This one is from Ramsey County, and it was entered into the property record in 1948, and it reads, the said premises shall be occupied only by persons of the Caucasian race. And finally, this one says, no person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or a tenant. So that language, it's hard to hear, right? So I always tell everyone, if you're hearing this for the first time, take a breath, right? What our team has been doing is that we've been leading community members in the work of mapping these restrictions. First in Hennepin County, now in Ramsey County. My colleagues have used computer scripts to comb through millions of property records to identify the documents that seem to have this racist language. Then we have uploaded these flag deeds to a crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. And we've invited volunteers to extract the information necessary to put these restrictions on a map. For our Hennepin County map, we had 3,000 volunteers who read 177,000 historic property deeds. They found 24,000 property parcels with racial covenants in Hennepin County. So take a look. This is the culmination of all that work. What you're seeing here is the spread of racial covenants through Hennepin County over time. You can see the time lapse in the upper right-hand corner. Each of these blue dots denotes an individual property parcel that was reserved exclusively for the use of white people. And all this blue that you're seeing here illuminates the 24,000 property parcels that we have identified that have these racial covenants. So no one has ever created a map of this kind before. This is the first comprehensive map of racial covenants ever created for an American city. And we've built it in collaboration with community. As we've done that, we have discovered it to be a really powerful platform for community conversations like this one, but also policymaking and research. So the text that I read that because I wanted you to hear how explicitly racist these are. You can't mistake the intent for anything other than what it is. This map shows you how widespread these restrictions were. But you also need to understand how powerful these restrictions are, were. And to understand that, you have to know how they were enforced. So they're backed up by the full power of the American judicial system. Covenants ran with the land, which meant that they could be enforced through the court system decades after they were embedded into deeds. And anyone who breached a covenant by selling a piece of restricted land to someone who was named in that covenant risked ending up in court. They risked losing the property altogether because it was a violation of the original property contract. If it was shown to be true, this property could go back to the person who put the covenant in the first place. Edmund Walton, for instance, in the case of that property on 35th Avenue South, or whoever his heirs were, even decades later, decades after he died. So here's one of the painful truths about covenants. Most white people thought they were necessary. So Black people, by contrast, saw covenants as a threat to basic liberty. Here in the Twin Cities, we had leaders like Nellie Francis, Marvel Jackson, Lena Olive Smith, Katie McWatt, who devoted their lives to fighting these practices. And they were joined by other civil rights activists all around the country. Black people put everything on the line to challenge these things. They bought houses with covenants. They moved into white neighborhoods. Whoops, there we go. And that's what Arthur and Edith Lee did in 1931 when they bought a tiny bungalow on the corner of 46th and Columbus in South Minneapolis. The family, the couple had a young daughter, Mary, who was about to enter kindergarten. And the house did not have a covenant on it, but it was a neighborhood. It was right on the edge of an area with covenants, and the neighbors perceived it to be a white neighborhood. And the couple quickly found themselves under siege. The neighbors first went to the Lees and demanded that they moved out. They tried to buy them out, and when they refused, they laid siege to the house. 5,000 to 6,000 people just basically stood outside the house for months in the summer of 1931. And the only reason that this crowd did not burn the house down and kill the Lees, frankly, is that Arthur had served in the military in World War I, and he was able to call on other veterans who formed an armed perimeter around the house to protect the family and to protect the house. But even despite this, the mob only grew. One person described it this way: 6,000 white people waiting to see that house burned. So as these racial boundaries hardened in American cities during the first half of the 20th century, this threat of white violence was always present. This was one of the main ways that covenants were enforced. People didn't bother going to court. In a lot of cases, they just called together a mob. So there were many families like the Lees who worked with the NAACP, which gave them really critical assistance and support. The NAACP was the organization ultimately that brought a series of court challenges that ended up at the United States Supreme Court in 1948. And that's when the Supreme Court declared covenants to be unenforceable in the Shelley v. Kramer decision. Unfortunately, that was not the end of racial covenants. And here in Minnesota, the state legislature was forced to pass a new law in 1953 that banned new covenants from being put into place. That still didn't make old covenants illegal. So then the legislature, at the urging of Josie Johnson and Katie McWatt, passed a Minnesota Fair Housing Act in 1962, which made all covenants illegal. And it was the federal government followed suit in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act, which of course was authored by the junior senator from Minnesota, Walter Mondale. So I would say that traditionally the story of covenants has been told, that's been the ending point when people have talked about this history. But ending the narrative here would be misleading because we're still living with the legacies of these policies. To understand exactly how deep the wounds were that were left by these practices, we need to grasp how covenants changed the urban landscape. And that means going back to 1910 when the first covenant was put in place. So this is a census demographic map from 1910. And here's what it shows. It shows that the city of Minneapolis was not particularly segregated in 1910. Black families, you can see these darker colored polygons all over the southern half of the city in particular. That indicates the presence of Black families. What we know from digging into the archival and newspaper record is that Black families were buying property and they were helping friends and family members do the same thing. So in 1910, the neighborhood that had the highest percentage of Black residents was near North. That's the darkest polygon on this map. But even that area was only 15% Black. We know that Black people were living near Lake Harriet. One Black family owned 4 acres that is now 50th in France. There are Black families living near Lake Nokomis along the Mississippi River. Of course, these are some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city today. So this could have continued, right? Black people could have been allowed to spread out in the growing city. But a different decision was made. The city took a different route very deliberately because Minneapolis, like a lot of the country, decided that racially integrated neighborhoods were dangerous. And after the Minneapolis Journal called on the real estate board to contain what it called a considerable Negro colony, that body adopted this ethics manual in 1913 that had been published by the National Association of Realtors. It declared that it was unethical for a real estate agent to introduce into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values. Today we call this real estate steering, and this practice became institutionalized at the same time that developers were experimenting with racial covenants, which of course were intended to establish the racial character of a neighborhood. And in the decades that followed, these practices together really changed the racial geography of not just Minneapolis, but all American cities. So here's what this looked like in Minneapolis. So you can see that 1910 map that I showed you first. Now here's what the city looks like in 1940. By 1940, Black people had been pushed out of all but a few neighborhoods. Those Black residents who were down by Lake Harriet, they're all gone. Same story with Lake Nokomis. There's no Black families living in Northeast Minneapolis at all at this point. And for the first time in the city's history, multiple census districts are predominantly Black. So what does that mean? It means after 30 years of covenants being in use, race determined your place of residence in the city of Lakes. Blacks were concentrated into a couple of small neighborhoods. Here's a key point about this. One of the ways that people have traditionally understood covenants is they've seen them as a response to an influx of Black people, the Great Migration, the movement of the rural African Americans to the urban North. But Minneapolis was not an endpoint for the Great Migration until later, until after World War II. The Black population of the city is about the same in 1910 and 1940. And again, what our archival and census research has shown is that these new majority-minority, so-called minority neighborhoods are not they're not an influx of people from somewhere else. It's the same people in these two maps. They're moved out of integrated neighborhoods and into these, concentrated into these pockets. So this story is in no way unique to Minneapolis. This urban reshuffling, the segregation by race is happening in every community across the country, across the nation. In the words of the poet Langston Hughes, Blacks were hemmed in, those were his words. That's the title of a 1949 poem where he lamented this situation in Chicago. He said, "They've got covenants restricting me, hemmed in on the south side, can't breathe free." And 71 years later, Black people are still struggling to breathe in Minneapolis. Please, 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 I can't breathe. That's what George Floyd pleaded as he lay pinned under the knee of a police officer. And the death of Mr. Floyd grows out of the structural racism that is so entrenched in Minneapolis. Residential segregation is one manifestation of this structural racism. Segregation, once it was established, has remained stubbornly entrenched. This map shows that the neighborhoods with covenants are still the whitest parts of the city today. So the red on this map is the covenants. The white shows a concentration of whiteness, and you can see that covenants are really clustered on these very white neighborhoods. And the way that people have thought about the urban environment, white neighborhoods have not been seen as problematic. Instead, all the attention has been directed at Black neighborhoods. And the policy solutions that have resulted just have not been very effective. As one scholar concluded, she said, basically, whatever the problem is in the American city, the answer is to move the Black people. See if I can, I'm having a little, whoops. Oop, okay, try that again. I haven't had this, okay, there we go. So one way this was done is through freeway construction. In the 1950s, freeways were regarded as critical to the growth of new white suburbs. White commuters needed a way to drive from their restricted communities to their jobs downtown. They were also seen as engines of what was known as urban renewal. So their construction was used to clear neighborhoods that planners regarded as blighted. So what this map shows, that was so hard to pull up, is that it shows our contemporary freeways overlaid on that fine-grained demographic map from 1940. You can see the neighborhoods where people of color could live after the introduction of covenants, and you can see the freeways. So across the country, freeways displaced millions of people and destroyed neighborhoods that had been inhabited by people of color. In Minneapolis, near north was flattened, 7 Corners was split in half, the old South Side was walled off from the whiter neighborhoods to the west. And these classified ads that I pulled up here were placed by Black families in Minneapolis who were desperate to find new homes after their houses were condemned by the DOT. So I've already shared a lot of our conclusions with you, but here's one thing that our team has come to recognize about covenants, that these restrictions didn't just impose segregation. Covenants were used to keep people of color out of the neighborhood, out of the city altogether. So developers quickly realized that covenants only worked if they kept everyone who was not white out. So they needed to be in place to be effective. They needed to be in place just as neighborhoods were being platted. So this is an aerial photograph of South Minneapolis that was taken in 1938. And these red polygons outline land that was racially restricted before this photo was taken. So as you can see, covenants are being embedded in the landscape before any other development takes place. They predate the roads, they predate the houses, they even predate the sewers. The first thing that developers are thinking about is what is the race of the people who are going to live here. And this practice, the fact that it was such standard practice, it really ensured that as American cities, as Minneapolis expanded, as other American cities expanded in this period, all new developments were reserved for white people. So in fact, developers used used racial covenants as marketing tools. They printed racial restrictions directly in their promotional material, like this ad from 1913 that stated that colored people were excluded from this new neighborhood in St. Paul, and the developer promised that, quote, restrictions will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. So as I intimated in the beginning, for me, this history is personal. Even as Minneapolis and St. Paul pushed out people who are not white through all these things that I've been talking about, it was welcoming newcomers like my grandparents. My grandparents were immigrants, they were from immigrant families that had roots in Sweden. They started their adult lives with no money and little formal schooling. Two of them were orphaned at really young ages. None of them made it past the 8th grade. But like a lot of immigrants, they had a huge capacity for hard work. And they worked in a lot of different situations. They worked as farmhands, domestic servants, they worked as lumberjacks, carpenters in small towns and all over the region. And then they came to the city. They came to Minneapolis looking for opportunity. And they found it in the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, they built businesses, they married, they saved their money. And in 1942, both sets of my grandparents bought houses. So this is a film that my grandfather had made to celebrate the acquisition of property in my family. So my uncle actually had it digitized and he put it up on YouTube. You can watch the whole thing, it's 2 hours. But what it shows is what a huge deal this was for my family. My grandparents invited everyone they had ever known to come and celebrate this moment. And now, thanks to our research, I have a little more context to understand the purchase of this home, because now I know that this house was located on a block that was blanketed by racial covenants. That black icon in the upper right-hand corner, that was my grandparents' house. The red you see is all covenants. My mom's family lived nearby, and the blocks that surrounded their houses were also carpeted with discriminatory deeds. So my grandparents were new arrivals, right? But they were regarded as white. This meant that they could build their lives in a place that was off limits to other Minneapolitans with similar incomes and educations. So I grew up as a kid visiting my grandparents in their homes near Lake Nokomis. And I grew up hearing stories from my parents about what an amazing neighborhood this was for them to grow up in. It wasn't super fancy, but my parents, they spent all their time outside at Lake Nokomis, swimming in the lake, skating in the winter, exploring Minnehaha Creek. And I think most critically, the neighborhood had really solid schools. Both my parents went to college. My mother went to graduate school. But all of this was only for white people. And my parents say that they never questioned why all their neighbors were Swedish, Norwegian, and German. You know, this uniform whiteness seemed to them, even now, utterly natural. And of course, we know it's at a moment in the city's history when actually the number of people of color in the city is increasing dramatically. We also know that my grandparents bought their homes at a moment that the United States was poised to see the largest expansion of its middle class in its history. And a lot of this prosperity rested on home ownership, which had been deliberately supported by new federal programs. But these new programs, they introduced, mortgage insurance that made affordable mortgages accessible to all kinds of people. They also introduced redlining. These discriminatory policies meant that 98% of FHA loans made between 1934 and 1962 went to white people. So these programs were created to benefit people like my grandparents, and like the GI Bill, they excluded people who were not white. So 2 generations later, I'm still benefiting from the fact that my grandparents were encouraged to buy homes in a part of the city where property values climbed throughout the 20th century. Our research shows that today, more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, houses in Hennepin County that had covenants, like the one owned by my grandparents, are worth 15% more than identical houses that didn't have covenants. My grandparents were able to pass this additional value on to me. When my grandfather died, the proceeds, his house was sold, the proceeds were distributed to the grandchildren, and I was able to use that portion to put a down payment on a house in South Minneapolis, where I looked for all the things that my parents talked about, like easy access to the chain of lakes, solid schools. And I'm fortunate. I never forget that I'm fortunate in this regard, but I'm not unusual. There's been research done by the National Association of Realtors that found that 30% of first-time home buyers get help from family to manage the purchase of a home. So like a lot of my peers, I was able to leverage the economic security of earlier generations to secure the future of my children. And my children are benefiting from this. But because their mom is a historian, I always emphasize to them that we carry our history with us. I want them to know that their lives have been determined in so many ways by the opportunities that were given to my grandparents. And I want them to know that these avenues for advancement were closed to people who are not white. Covenants worked with redlining, that federal policy that declared Black neighborhoods to be too hazardous for federally underwritten loans to depress homeownership rates for Blacks. When they targeted anyone who was perceived to be not white using a definition that was capricious and ever shifting. The combined impact of covenants plus redlining was particularly devastating for Blacks who were shut out of property ownership. Today in the Twin Cities, we have the highest gap between Black and white homeownership rates for any major metropolitan area in the country. 75% of white families own their homes, only 23% of Black families can make the same claim. So property ownership is actually tied to citizenship in a lot of ways in the United States, but I think most directly it's essential for wealth accumulation. You can draw a straight line from these historic restrictions on property ownership to the contemporary racial wealth gap. It's 10 to 1 today. That means for every dollar owned by the average white family, the average Black family has less than a dime. So Mapping Prejudice, the work that we're doing as a team is designed to help people see structural racism. And when I say structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that's backed by legal authority and institutional control. So racial covenants are classic manifestations of structural racism. Racism is not just a matter of personal bias. It's not the sentiments of people like these who picketed the fair housing hearings in Minnesota in 1962. You know, they are carrying these signs that make their sentiments, their bigotry plain. We want people to understand that it's not just this blatant racism, it's structures. We want people to see how racist ideology has been embedded into community institutions over decades, that it's been written into these foundational documents of our communities. And we want people to know that structural racism undergirds our community maps. It sorts people into zones of privilege and dispossession, and even people who live right next to each other, it sends them on different trajectories. So I think this history is useful because it helps us to understand why seems to be the same group of people who are most vulnerable to housing insecurity, which of course, as I said at the beginning, affects the health, educational opportunities, and job prospects of generations. So structural racism undergirds a system that was built to keep Black and brown people from owning property. It was designed to keep them from amassing wealth. It was designed to keep Black bodies out of spaces that seemed desirable, that were seen as desirable. It was designed to keep Black and brown bodies out of the spaces that I was taught as a child belong to all of us. So the question is, what do we do? I would say that the time has come, it's past due, time to make amends. So remembering, acknowledging this history is the first step, but then we have to take action. So here's a place to start. You can help us document this history. We're now mapping covenants in Ramsey County, and we need volunteers. We need you to do this work. But that's, of course, just the first step. Then you need to share what you learn with friends, with family members, and elected officials. It's up to all of us to make sure that this awareness translates into action. We need to avoid the mistakes of the past. As Minneapolis City Council member Jeremiah Ellison recently warned, he wrote a piece in the New York Times. He said, during every crisis, well-meaning white people here make a ritual of acknowledging the city's steep inequities. It's as if people think the mere acknowledgement is the work. The work is more than this, but to figure out what we need to change, we need to listen to the people who've been most affected. One place to start is this policy agenda developed by the Alliance, which is a coalition of housing and growth organizations led by people of color. So the solutions are going to cost money, that's for certain. We need to invest in housing, we need to invest in schools, in neighborhoods, and in people. But we have to think about what the alternatives are, right? The alternatives are a lot worse. And we also have to understand that this reparative work goes beyond money. It demands moral capital, right? Moral courage. Reparations, in the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, is, quote, the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. It's more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handoff, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. Reparations and in the words of Coates, will lead to a national reckoning that will lead to spiritual renewal. So I'm speaking on behalf of the whole Mapping Prejudice team when I say I'm ready to be part of this renewal, and we're delighted to have you join us in this work as well. So with that, I'm going to open it to questions, hopefully. Steve, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
So I'll stop sharing if that's okay.
Thank you, Kirsten. Every time I listen to the presentation, I learn more. And again, I'll use the word twice today. Groundbreaking is your research and the work of your colleagues. So thank you. You're truly integrating the past with the present and allowing us to both look backwards and understand and use that as a base for what we need to do going forward. I'll just pick up the book off my bookshelf, Josie's book, and she takes about 3 or 4 pages, our wonderful civil rights icon, to discuss housing discrimination, and she notes the presence of racial covenants as one of the instruments used to maintain segregation in the Twin Cities. I see in the chat there have been a fair number of questions, Kirsten, about the relationship of restrictive housing covenants to the Jewish community. The Jewish community faced, along with the African American community, discrimination in housing. One of the reasons that Hubert Humphrey, when elected mayor in 1945, so vigorously pursued amongst the first anti-job discrimination open housing ordinances in the country was because of the widespread discrimination in the city. Japanese Americans, Jews, African Americans. Maybe you can talk about this a little bit. Growing up in the Jewish community, you heard a lot of discussion, urban legend-wise, probably more likely, about restrictive housing covenants directed against Jews. Your research seems to show that wasn't so often the case. Nevertheless, Jews suffered some and probably a significant amount of housing discrimination. That's a long prelude to this question, but maybe you can help edify us a little bit about this situation.
I knew that this would be a question, and this is frankly one of the most intriguing parts of this research for our team, because the Jewish community here has been some of the memory keepers on this history. When I talk about this widespread amnesia, covenants have not been forgotten in the Jewish community. So, and so especially reading through here, talking to people, reading through oral histories, everyone always talked about racial covenants and how it really determined where people could live. So when we started really doing this comprehensive accounting of racial covenants and seeing what the language said and where they were, we were really surprised and confounded, frankly, in the beginning to find that so few mentioned Jews explicitly. So of course they had language like sometimes like Aryan or Caucasian. So we were puzzled by this, that fewer than 1% of the covenants that we found actually explicitly mentioned Jews. And this is unique to Minneapolis, because certainly around the country we hear about Jews being targeted by these covenants. So that question, it seemed to be this omission, led us to the archives and to the research, and we started with Gunther Platt's book, The History of Jews in Minnesota, and he highlighted a law that was passed in, you're like me, you like to hold up the volume, right? Yeah, he highlighted a law that was passed in 1919, written by a Minneapolis lawyer named Emanuel Cohen. Emanuel Cohen brought this law to the Minnesota legislature, and they passed it almost unanimously, that forbade discrimination on the basis of religion in real estate transactions. So this seemed to, I think this explains why the language changed in 1919 and why explicit references to Jews really dropped out. But it doesn't tell the whole story, in the sense that the passage of that law certainly didn't stem the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Minneapolis, which I would say crescendoed through World War II, and resulted in Minneapolis being named the capital of anti-Semitism by Carrie McWilliams in 1946. And certainly it was a stronghold of anti-Semitic, I would say, proto-fascist American organizations in the 30s. But I think it complicated the history of Jews and property ownership, because the language shifted to be along the lines of Caucasian, who only Caucasians can live on this property, or only people who are, bars people who are not Caucasian. So then the question was, who's white? Who's considered white and who's not considered white? And for Jews, there was never a simple question or a simple answer rather to that question. And it was Jews were perceived to be in a gray area, a liminal area between whiteness and blackness, and a lot of Jews really worked hard to be distinguished from black people, right? And so you see sort of the uneven enforcement of anti-Semitism. So you have places like Edina, where the racial covenants that specify only Caucasian people can live here it didn't seem to include Jews. But in places like St. Louis Park, and I want to do a shout out for my colleague Maggie Mills, who just finished a map of St. Louis Park that shows how Jews were able to buy houses in large numbers in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in St. Louis Park. They bought properties that had these restrictive covenants on them, that they were seen to be white in certain places. So the history is more complicated, right, than we originally thought. Does that help?
It does. Thank you, Kirsten. Appreciate it very much. As I said before, I'm very pleased and thankful to my JCRC colleagues, Laura Zell, Ellen Morrissey, Stanley Rahami, and Ethan Roberts, who are helping with today's Living Room webinar. Our board chair, Marty Chester. Laura is going to help field some questions now. Okay? Thank you.
Sure. So we have a question, Kirsten. What do you see as appropriate reparations?
Again, I don't think I'm the right person to ask. I feel like we have positioned ourselves with Mapping Prejudice to say that that reparations are in order, right? And I think that has been there's been a lot of resistance even to that idea, that reparations are in order. I mean, these were not only private policies. This was the official policy of government at all levels in the United States: local government, state government, federal government. This was done on behalf of the American people, these racist policies. So I do feel like reparations are in order. There's been significant harms perpetuated that have never been addressed. So that's the stance of Mapping Prejudice, that we are making a case for reparations. But what those reparations look like, I think that is the real discussion. And frankly, we're not the appropriate people to ask, because we have benefited from many of these policies. It's important for us to I think amplify the voices of the people who have been most affected by these policies, to figure out like what do we need to amend, or to make up for the harms that have been perpetuated. Laura, you're
muted. Sorry, I'll just remind people to please post your questions in the chat. A lot of them have been answered by Maggie and Russell, which is terrific. Another question is, sorry, please, can you talk about exclusionary zoning? And if not, that's okay.
No.
Right.
Yeah, I can talk about it in the most. So I mean, yeah, zoning. Here's one thing that I know about zoning and the way it connects to covenants is that, for instance, in Minneapolis did not have single-family zoning until the year that covenants became illegal. right? And so the zoning policies in Minneapolis were revamped in the very year that covenants became illegal. And the result of that has been really those zoning changes really locked in a lot of the patterns that were established by covenants. And I would say that that's the city of Minneapolis. I would say that that's even been more pronounced in the suburbs. And so one way, you know, a lot of suburbs have seen it as very important to make sure that they create zoning laws that make it impossible to build affordable housing, to build multifamily housing, to build the kind of housing that's accessible to people who have been locked out of wealth accumulation over many generations. So yes, I think zoning regulations are one really key piece of how we're going to move forward and build more equitable, more integrated, more stable communities. But it's just one piece, obviously. It's not the silver bullet for really doing reparative work.
Great, thank you. Steve, did you want to ask a question? Were you about
Well,
to
I was
ask
going to
a
make a
question?
comment. You know, so much of history is personal. My grandparents moved out of the north side to St. Louis Park in 1949.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom originally wanted to stay at North High School, but it was kind of a pain to take 2 buses back to North. So a friend of hers convinced her to go to St. Louis Park High School for a day and try it out. There were only 4 Jewish kids in her class. It was a class of about 200 kids. And she remembers, it's interesting, thinking how welcoming the kids were in her class, and that there weren't really any social castes or any cohorts or anything, and that pretty much people, of course, mixed fairly freely. And she ended up really liking her St. Louis Park experience, so much so we had 3 generations of kids who have graduated from the St. Louis Park schools. But in my high school class, we had exactly 3 African Americans out of 550 kids in St. Louis Park. So you talk about the vestige in St. Louis Park of living arrangements and how where people live was controlled well beyond Shelley B. Kramer and the like.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, 2 of the 3 kids were, one was Cassius Ellis' family. Cassius was the chief of staff at Mount Sinai Hospital, and the other was Dr. Robert Lewis, who's one of the first African-American veterinarians in Minnesota. He had his practice in St. Louis Park.
Right.
So that the exception almost defines the rule.
Right. Exactly. And that's Russell has done. He wrote his senior thesis at Carleton and has delved into the Robert Lewis story in particular in St. Louis Park, so he can speak to that for sure.
Terrific. Laura, do we have some more questions that people would like answered? Okay.
We do. There's one that was emailed. This one says, we understand that our home deed makes reference to unstated neighborhood covenants. What is the process for finding specifically what those are? Oops, sorry, just lost it. And getting them removed from our deed.
Great. I'm glad you asked that question. So in part in response to Mapping Prejudice, the Minnesota State Legislature passed a law in 2019 that made it possible for any property owner in Minnesota to quote unquote discharge the covenant. So there's now a form online that people can fill out, and there's also a coalition that has taken shape. It's called the Just Deeds Coalition, and it's a group of volunteers, lawyers, real estate professionals, city officials from Robbinsdale, Crystal, Golden Valley, and they want to help people navigate this process of discharging the covenant. So you can go actually to the Golden Valley, city website to find out more about this assistance. So they've been terrific in terms of helping people. So we want to emphasize, though, we think we are really pleased that there's a avenue for people who want to discharge the covenant, but we hope that this is an educational moment for people, and that people see it as the beginning of their journey of acknowledging this history and figuring out what they want their role is to be going forward. What action besides the discharging the covenant in your own deed, what are the bigger actions that you're going to take to try to promote racial equity and justice in our community?
Thank you. Any more questions, Laura?
Yes, yes.
I'll note we're approaching about 1 hour, so maybe one or two more questions.
Sure.
Thank you.
If I were to teach a lesson in a government class for high school students, what resources would you recommend to help tell this story?
Oh, yay. Well, we have an educator's guide on our website. If you go to www.mappingprejudice.org, I think Maggie can drop it in the chat here. But Maggie and I actually developed a guide, especially in this remote learning environment. Mapping Prejudice has a lot of resources for teachers to help teach this subject.
Okay, another question is, does your research involve the impact on African-American access to business loans and entrepreneurship?
We do not. That is outside of our purview. Super important work. It's all connected, of course, because people use their home equity all the time, to build their businesses. And again, I think it's a example of how access to credit for housing really is at the core of so many of these other disparities.
Or perhaps one more question if there is. Oops.
Sorry, I just want to remind people in the chat, some resources are being posted. The educator guide, I believe the equity and inclusion restrictive covenant for Golden Valley. And Kirsten, wasn't there an action guide that do you want to speak to that a little bit? And if we could post that.
Yeah, we can post that. Maggie, do you have that? Or did I send it to you, Laura? I can't remember. So we've been doing a lot of events with especially corporations now after the murder of George Floyd. And so again, like we've been really preoccupied in Mapping Prejudice, that we've been pleased to see this increased awareness of this history, but we want to make sure that we want to help people actually create a blueprint for action. We don't want it to stall out with, oh my gosh, I'm aware of this terrible history, but I don't know how it connects to what's going on today. So we created an action guide to basically, not be directive with people, but to help people sort of reflect and think about where they can plug in. Because I just want to be clear, there's not one solution to this, to this situation. There's not one piece of legislation that you can support that's going to solve all this. And there's so many different ways that you can plug in and make a difference and really build political will and political support for really transformative policymaking.
Laura, perhaps it's a great place to stop with that thesis statement. Kirsten, and thanks to Maggie and Russell and your entire team for all that you have learned and all that you've taught and how you continue to educate all of us. I'll note at our height, we had about 108 participants, and up to a couple of minutes ago, we had 103 participants. So you were engaging people at about a 95% clip. So that's remarkable. Well done. Thank you for everyone for joining us. We'll have further living room webinars coming up. We'll keep you informed. Thank you for all your contributions, and thank you for your support of the JCRC, as well as for Kirsten's work. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.